On the home front in World War II, we tend to find that the response to the war looks extremely similar in a lot of ways to World War I. This makes a lot of sense when you think about it, since we're pretty successful in World War I, so it's essentially the logic that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And just as in World War I, communities of color, laborers, and women, groups which often overlap as well, used the opportunities and rhetoric of the war to call for greater civil rights. One thing that we absolutely have to understand about World War II is that it was more a war of logistics than actual fighting. This is what sets it apart from every war before it. And in watching years of lead up to actual fighting, even more so than the First World War, the United States knew this and was ready. We were already taking part in the logistical side of things through things like cash and carry and lend-lease before our actual involvement anyway. But immediately upon the US's declaration of war, US factories and farms transitioned into efficiency machines for war effort. And they were able to do this through government intervention, takeover really, and the coordination of what's called the War Production Board. So while the president was in charge of the military and dealing with coordinating all of their maneuvers and generals and such, the War Production Board handled literally everything else. They told factories what to produce and farmers what to grow. They were in charge of producing the propaganda and messaging through the Office of War Information. They also created the Office of Research and Development that did scientific and military experiments that created things like, eventually, the atomic bomb. One of their lesser-known military experiments was to test the effects of mustard gas and other chemical agents on our own troops. The men chosen for this assignment were rarely informed of the actual risks and only given very little in exchange for things like a few extra days off. The experiments were also extremely race-based. The scientist in charge, Cornelius Rhodes, who already had a horrible history with the people of Puerto Rico, used men of African, Japanese, and Puerto Rican descent to see if somehow they reacted differently than their white peers against mustard gas, men who didn't need to be tested because we already knew how they fared. Despite torturing these troops for the sake of his research, Cornelius Rhodes was given a ton of extra money to continue chemical trials and is now highly praised in the medical community because those additional trials led to the discovery of chemotherapy. On the business side of things, American factories ramped up production dramatically after officially declaring war, although that's not to say we weren't doing some production beforehand. And seeing Germany's blitzkrieg in Poland, the U.S. began making tanks, which would eventually be available for lend-lease. In 1940, we produced about 3,300 tanks versus about 1,400 each in Britain and Germany. 3 years later, the U.S. produced 29,500 tanks, more in a single year than Germany produced during the entire war. What about planes? In 1939, the U.S. produced almost 5,900 planes valued at about $280 million. In 1944, we produced just over 96,000 planes valued at almost $17 billion. Although the valuation can be deceiving because the cost of manufacturing dropped as we made more. And as you can see from the chart on the left of the screen, at least part of the growth of this manufacturing came from government ownership of raw materials and new manufacturing plants. This was especially the case in industries like aircraft, munitions, and ship construction or repair. That's not to say that the government suddenly owned all of the businesses, not by any means. In fact, actual government ownership of business was quite small. In the majority of cases where the government was in control, it was through government-sponsored contracts that were enforced by wartime measures. One effect of government control over contracts was their increased control over labor conditions and labor rights, just like we saw in World War I. By the Second World War, though, there have been substantial changes to national labor trends in the form of the addition of the CIO as a national labor union, as well as the AFL, and the passing of the Wagner Act in 1935. If you recall from the New Deal, the Wagner Act ensured that things like collective bargaining with one's employer were perfectly legal. When the Wagner Act was passed, it was backed by a number of Southern congressmen who didn't actually support the premise of what the law said. But they voted for it because at the time, it wouldn't really affect them. Labor unions weren't really a huge deal in the South, so they didn't really lose anything by backing the bill. But as the U.S. moved towards World War II, and then especially after World War II, Southern industrialization brought on by wartime mobilization meant that unionization was an increasingly important topic for Southerners. And this was a huge problem for Southern congressmen and white Southerners in general, because unions often led to discussions for better labor conditions across racial lines, which would disrupt the racist and segregationist system that they'd come to rely on. In complaining about the AFL-CIO in June of 1943, Georgia Congressman John Gibson compared the labor unions to communists and remarked that they were out to fool the, quote, lower classes, calling out African Americans in particular. He went on to compare the idea of labor reform to enslavement, claiming that, quote, instead of improving labor conditions, the great middle class will be entirely done away with, and all except the few whip bosses will live in slavery, end quote. What Gibson and others like him failed to understand, other than basic knowledge of our nation's history, was that the labor reforms the AFL-CIO hoped to bring to the South were intended to expand the supposed great middle class, not destroy it. But the problem with his racist logic was that he was unwilling to allow the expansion of that economic class to other Southerners if it meant an expansion of it to Black Americans, and there wasn't really a way to disrupt labor conditions legally without disrupting them for all. So during World War II in 1943, Howard Smith of Virginia and Tom Connally of Texas pushed through the Smith-Connally Anti-Strike Act, which gave the president authority to seize war plants when there was a threat of strike. President Roosevelt, who had been more or less friendly to labor during the New Deal era, vetoed the bill, but it was passed over his veto. And so in an effort to keep people from striking, the Office of War Information put out a whole bunch of propaganda posters reminding people that they were in it together. Except, as you can see from our comparison here, these were slightly different in many cases from those on World War I. Whereas the posters from World War I tended to focus on disputes between bosses and laborers, World War II posters tended to focus on keeping harmony between different racial groups. This is especially important when you remember that things like the Red Summer were not that long ago. And the economic hardship of the Great Depression that we were just in didn't do a ton of good to help with racial discrimination. But in essence, the branding here is very much similar. Just as in World War I, during World War II, women flocked to industrial centers to fill necessary jobs for the war effort. It's during this war, though, that we start to see the name Rosie the Riveter used to describe these women. The name comes from the 1942 song Rosie the Riveter and the 1943 Saturday Evening Post cover on the left by Norman Rockwell. The problem with Rockwell's imagery, though, was that it portrayed women as masculine and dirty, which no woman wanted to be seen as. At the time, many women were going to work in these factories and would still do their hair and put on a full face of makeup. So the imagery portrayed here by Rockwell wasn't how they saw themselves at all, which is why in popular culture, the image from the right, the much less masculine we can do it Rosie, is the one that we're usually more familiar with. This Rosie still has the strength to get the job done. She's still a symbol of women's independence and strength, but holds a compromise with femininity and poise. Other forms of propaganda from the period that drove women into the workplace tried to emphasize the role of women in all of our nation's wartime conflicts, like the poster on the right. Posters like this went a long way, and correctly so, of pointing out that women have contributed in meaningful ways to wartime conflicts for as long as the United States has been fighting. African American laborers also mobilized dramatically, just like they did in World War I. If you recall, during the First World War, African Americans moved out of the South and into the northern cities to fill necessary wartime vacancies in industrial positions. We called this the Great Migration. During the Second World War, there's a second Great Migration for exactly the same reason. In the chart on the left, it shows the percentage of African Americans living in the American South over time, and you can see the dramatic decrease that occurs from 1910 to 1950 as a result of these two events. But we also know that the increase in African American laborers and industrial jobs leads to increased discrimination. This was true in World War I and in the period that followed during the 20s and 30s, despite increased union membership and even government intervention during the war itself. So during World War II, President Roosevelt established the Fair Employment Practices Commission with the goal of preventing discrimination against African Americans in defense jobs. Although remember, he doesn't have any real authority over private sectors that are working outside of government contracts or that aren't connected to the war effort. And if you notice in the photo of the actual commission here on the right, literally all but two of the people that are part of this commission are white, and only two are women, both of whom are white. So in terms of a group who's actually in the best position to identify and meet the needs of the Black community, this committee leaves a bit to be desired. But despite its shortcomings, the committee's very existence on the federal level was at least symbolically a step in an inclusive direction for workers of color. It was a step that didn't last, though. Despite Roosevelt's attempts, Congress failed to make it permanent at war's end. In the non-industrial sector, the United States actively sought the help of Mexican workers to help with agricultural labor. In August 1942, Congress officially began what's called the Bracero Program that lasted until 1964. The program provided temporary or seasonal visas to Mexican citizens to come to work in the United States. During that time, the U.S. agreed to certain terms regarding housing, wages, and labor conditions. On top of this, 10% of the laborer's paycheck would be held back and sent to the Mexican government to be given to them when they returned, almost like collateral. Although many braceros discovered upon returning to Mexico that the 10% simply disappeared, and some people are still stuck suing the Mexican government over this. As laborers in the U.S., though, braceros experienced extreme discrimination. This isn't new. We know that during World War I, the U.S. had a more informal recruitment program for Mexican laborers in the wake of the First Great Migration, and that when the Depression hit, the U.S. government then forced deportations of both those Mexican laborers and their American-born and therefore American citizen children. The return of Mexican laborers in the South and West then led to massive discrimination once again. And this time, the children of those original laborers, who often were the braceros who came back during World War II, were now teenagers and young adults who saw themselves as equal partakers of Mexican and popular American culture. This tension came to a head in 1943 in what are called the Zoot Suit riots. In the early 1940s, the zoot suit became popular as a fashion statement among young minority, primarily African American and Latino men. You can see an image of what this generally looks like here on the right, but it's essentially a suit that's generally baggy and hangs rather loose. The problem with this here in 1943 is that during the war, one of the things that we're rationing is fabric. So it can be used for uniforms and blankets and such overseas. So the problem here in Los Angeles, especially where you have a high concentration of young Latino men, is that we've got returning servicemen coming back from the Pacific Front who are coming off of ships and getting drunk on leave and then get into fights with these young guys wearing this fashionable suit because they think that they're being ridiculously unpatriotic for wearing this suit made of excessive amounts of fabric that in their minds could be going to any number of better places. The sailors also tend to heap a ton of criticism on the young Latino dudes for being out in their flashy gear rather than patriotically serving like they were, which was actually really dumb logic because one, most of the guys they were fighting with were too young to serve anyway, and two, Mexican Americans served in World War II in really high numbers proportionally to their percentage in the general population. But in any case, this led to violence, especially on the West Coast, that is usually referred to as the Zoot Suit riots. Although it's really worth pointing out that 90% of the violence was coming from the soldiers and 90% of the people put in jail were the young Latino guys. I mean, taxi drivers in Los Angeles would offer free rides to servicemen so that they could go to other parts of the city and gang up on anyone they saw wearing a Zoot Suit. Of course, the local papers framed the event as white men needing to save the city from a wave of criminal immigrants, but in reality, the violence stopped as soon as the army barred the soldiers from leaving their barracks. So just like the mobilization of our labor forces was similar to World War I, so was the way that we went about making extra money for the war. During World War II, Americans got really crafty with their war bonds. We obviously had the traditional posters like the one in the middle for convincing people that it was an essential part of their life. And really in this one, it's almost tied to a religious duty. It's telling people to set aside 10% of their income each month, which in Christian churches is the amount that you give each month to the church as a tithe. So in essence, they're trying to tie together your understanding of patriotic duty and religious duty as one thing, because really for a lot of people, they are one thing. But even more so, people start to get really crafty with how they convince people to buy war bonds and war bond stamps, which are a slightly cheaper amount. Like sometimes literally crafty. So, for example, high schools would convince students to use war bond stamps in lieu of flowers for things like homecoming mums and corsages. So, you would see a war bond prom/homecoming corsage here on the left. So essentially, the bigger your corsage or the more expensive the stamps, the more your boyfriend or girlfriend likes you, or at least likes your country, which brings a whole different level to peer pressure. World War II also sees the return of victory gardens. This is the exact same purpose as they had in World War I. The concept is that if you grow your own vegetables, you can free up commercial farmers to grow necessary crops to send exclusively overseas. They don't have to worry about growing things to fill your grocery store. Notice here that the woman in our victory garden poster is a bit different than the woman we saw in World War I, though. She's a bit more realistic about her gardening. In the World War I cartoon that we saw a while back, the woman was sowing seeds in a patriotic flag dress, which is really just not realistic at all. I do a lot of gardening, and never once have I thought to go rummaging around in the dirt in a dress and sandals. But here we have a more of the homely version of our woman farmer. She's still a great-looking gal, but clearly a more realistic in her expectations of what gardening or farming looks like. This has a very much the same feel of the Rosie the Riveter look to it, the idea that women can still be feminine and good at the things that need to get the job done. One of the things that's actually different from World War I is rationing, since one, our involvement in World War I was not very long, and two, Herbert Hoover ran this country like a well-oiled machine. We didn't really need widespread rationing. It might be like today when you go to the store and find a sign that says please take only one, but it wasn't super strictly enforced. This definitely is. So how it works is that you'd get a ration book for a certain key good or goods according to the number of people in your family. Things like gasoline, flour and sugar, clothing, shoes and tires, since they contain rubber. Each month you'd get a set number of these things. This was the government's way of making sure that 1, stores wouldn't run out of these things, 2, they would have enough of these things for the war effort, but 3, that the prices of these goods on the home front also wouldn't go absolutely crazy. Because if you remember from the start of COVID, one of the things that happened was that people started like hoarding toilet paper. And then once there finally was toilet paper back in stock, it was crazy expensive because the manufacturers were afraid that if people did a run on it again, they'd run out. So they hiked up the price to control people buying it like crazy. This is why the government set limits on how much people could buy instead during World War II, so that there wouldn't be a need for the market to increase prices. They also put out posters to remind people that rationing and saving things, recycling, before recycling was cool essentially, was their patriotic duty. Or you'd have cartoonists like Dr. Seuss here essentially reminding people that they need to be careful with their driving. You need to make sure that your tires last, because every time you need to get new tires, that's one less set of tires that the soldiers have overseas. Intersecting all of these areas of mobilization was the Office of War Information, the government's propaganda machine. They controlled everything said about wartime industries, the military, government programs and services, and media. Within this propaganda, though, which existed in print, film, radio, and other forms, it's worth pointing out the different ways that we as Americans treated our Japanese and German enemies. In print media in particular, the Japanese were almost always portrayed as some kind of half-human, animal-type creature, while Hitler and other Germans are caricatured as themselves, or normal human beings. This isn't accidental. There's a reason for this, whether it was consciously done or not. During the war, the United States treated the Japanese as an enemy other, as a force and people so foreign to themselves culturally and racially that they couldn't possibly be understood. The inherent racism of this thinking is what led to their portrayal as non-humans in propaganda, while Hitler was portrayed as more or less normal. Because the Germans were white and hailed from a more or less Western tradition of thinking, they were people we could understand. We might hate them and think they were totally disagreeable, but at least we understood them, the way they acted, the way they thought. It was the same line of racist thinking in part that led to the rounding up of Japanese Americans and their immigrant parents into concentration camps during the war and the complete violation of their civil liberties. So that's what industrial workers were up to, but what about all of those who lended their service to the military? In this way, too, there are many similarities to the First World War, although some considerable differences as well. Just as in World War I, young men were called upon for selective service, or the draft. Remember, selective service does not mean that you are selecting to serve. It means that you are selected to serve. Unless you have some kind of medical condition that would preclude you from service, this is not optional. Also, keep in mind that we don't really have draft dodgers at this point, nor did we in World War I. That won't really become much of a thing until the war in Vietnam, and for very specific reasons that we'll discuss when we get there. The Army also opens up its ranks to women during the war in the Women's Army Corps, or WACS. If you recall, the Army allowed women to serve in the Signal Corps as Hello Girls during World War I, but was super rude, at least compared to the Navy, and didn't provide them with a veteran's distinction or the benefits that went with it after the war. So this is technically not the first time women are serving in the Army, but it's definitely in a much more expanded and more official capacity than before. But essentially, these women are filling administrative jobs. That way, the men who would normally be doing those administrative jobs can be deployed. So this would be things like typing and transcribing official reports, answering phones and manning switchboards, and attending meetings as the official minutes keeper and taking notes for officers. I also want to point out that there are women who did serve in non-administrative roles as pilots, which is not technically a combat role, at least according to the military, but I'm not going to call it a desk job either. These nearly 1,100 women were the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, which is so much cooler than when we call white Anglo-Saxon Protestants WASPs. They could fly everything from tiny planes to giant bombers, although they were usually not going like super far. A lot of times their job was to fly them across the country to deliver the planes to places they needed to go for maintenance or shipment or to another base before a mission. But this was a crazy important job because, as we said earlier, like 90% of this war and the success of it was logistics. And this meant that men who were supposed to be flying them for missions were actually free to, fly more missions. And it wasn't just fun and games for these women either, since some of the planes that they were flying had maintenance issues, which is why they needed to be sent to other places. Some of them had damage from battle. They sometimes had serious problems when the women were flying them, and it took really skilled pilots to get them from place to place. And 38 of the women in the program died in service to their country. Having learned something from World War I, white supremacists in the structure of the military and government found ways to suppress the involvement of African Americans during World War II. When African American men attempted to enlist or register for the draft, as 2.5 million did, many were told that it wouldn't be possible for them to, since there weren't sufficient numbers of segregated training facilities. The Army also adopted more rigid requirements for literacy to keep down the number of African American troops, since Jim Crow educational policies meant that black schools often received inadequate funding and therefore led to lower literacy rates. Although by socioeconomic status, white Southerners really weren't terribly far behind. Despite this, over 1.2 million African Americans served in the war by 1945. All served in segregated combat units like the 92nd Infantry or Buffalo Soldiers of the Army, who were sent to Italy. In the 370th Regiment of this division was Vernon Baker, the only African American to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his valor in World War II, not until years later, though. After being left in charge of his unit, Baker took out 2 machine gun nests and then took on enemy fire by himself, while others evacuated the wounded men from his unit. He then led his men through a literal minefield through heavy fire until they reached their intended destination. As his official commendation reads, quote, "Second Lieutenant Baker's fighting spirit and daring leadership were an inspiration to his men and exemplify the highest traditions of the armed services." Or there's the Tuskegee Airmen, a segregated unit of the U.S. Army Air Corps that flew missions to protect bombers, which is an incredibly important and essential part of this kind of warfare. The bombers they were escorting were massive and not easy to maneuver, and really only had enough gas to get exactly where they needed to go and back. So if the Germans came out and tried to attack them, they had to keep going straight in the direction they were headed. So it was the job of the Tuskegee Airmen to fly alongside them and protect them in the case of attacks. If they failed, the entire mission failed. Entire cities might fall apart. So no pressure. But even more than just their expertise in flying, they were mechanics and flight operators and navigators, both in the sense that the Tuskegee Airmen were a team, not just the pilots, and also in the sense that sometimes the government didn't give them the money they needed to do their job properly, so they had to be able to do more than one of those jobs. And it wasn't just men. There were at least 3 women on their team whose job it was to train the men in how to use their equipment properly. In all this, African American leaders on the home front fought to ensure that when black servicemen returned home, their service would be met with respect, actual respect. They also fought to ensure that Jim Crow wouldn't be able to stand up to the sacrifices of black men and women on the home front who worked just as hard, sometimes twice as hard, as everyone else to contribute to the war effort. And so as the Office of War Information cranked out propaganda reminding Americans how our great democracy is compared to Hitler's fascism, black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois put them in a reality check. In the crisis, he encouraged African Americans to contribute to the war effort, reminded them that this country is only as good as we contribute to making it. But he also wrote, quote, "A lily white navy cannot fight for a free world. A Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world. Jim Crow strategy, no matter how grand a scale, cannot build a free world." Du Bois knew that this was structural racism in the military and Western governments and colonization and global economic systems, and that would have to change in order for true freedom to come about. So he and the NAACP fought for a double V for victory, victory abroad and victory at home for equality. Because as writer Stephen Ambrose put it, quote, "The world's greatest democracy fought the world's greatest racist with a segregated army." World War II also saw changes to what wartime service looked like for Native American servicemen. Just like all of our other major service groups, Native Americans have been contributing to wartime service in both military and civilian capacities in essentially every war we fought in the United States, including World War I. During that global conflict, the citizenship status of a lot of tribes was a bit of a patchwork due to lingering results of the Dawes Act. But like African Americans and women, many tribal leaders and citizens hoped that wartime service would lead to increased civil rights after the war's conclusion. For a lot of Native American men in particular, though, the idea of serving in the U.S. military was really personally conflicting, since they'd spent years trying to fight against the stereotype of being just warriors or fighting savages. So the mental balancing of considering the trade-off between benefits and downfalls here wasn't something to be taken lightly. This was especially the case in World War II, where the military's prime objective was to use Native American recruits as code talkers, since their native tongues were extremely complex. In theory, more complex than even a computer could crack, since they weren't based in a mathematically based code. This essentially wasn't a new idea. The government did the same thing on a really dialed back scale during World War I as well. But the personal conflict here was that this same government had spent essentially half a century literally beating this language out of these tribes at boarding schools under the premise of things like kill the Indian, save the man. But now they want those same men to use that language to be used to kill other people? Well, that's complicated. But seeing the benefits that could happen, after all, World War I did eventually lead to Native American citizenship in 1924. Over 12,000 Native American men volunteered as what are referred to as Navajo code talkers during World War II, named after the name of the code, not the tribe that the men came from. Since the men came from a variety of tribes, they'd sometimes just talk in their native tongue to convey the codes, but usually they used the Navajo code developed specifically for the task. If there was something that they didn't have a Navajo equivalent for, like the word tank, they'd think of something that they could all agree would be a close approximation, like the word turtle, and use that. After the war, these men did benefit from things like the GI Bill, which provided for college education, health care through the VA, and low-interest home loans. But this also meant that these young men didn't return to the reservations they came from, or at least not for long. And this contributed to further economic collapse of an already fragile system. Our last group of service people to discuss here are those from the LGBTQ+ community who filled the ranks of the Army, Navy, and Women's Corps. When Pearl Harbor occurred, people didn't really stop to think a whole lot about their sexual orientation before dedicating their service to the military. That's not to say that the thought didn't occur to them. People who are of oppressed communities never have the luxury of forgetting that. But as Tom Reddy of the U.S. Marine Corps said, whatever attitudes we had about non-involvement immediately disappeared after Pearl Harbor, and we became as much a part of the war effort as everyone else. If only everyone else saw it that way. In 1941, Secretary of War Henry Stimson cracked down on what he called, quote, sodomists, and called for them to be court-martialed and sentenced to hard labor. But court-martials are expensive and, even more importantly for the moment, time-consuming. So by the following year, he compromised with what are called Section 8 blue discharges on account of the fact that they were printed on blue paper. Very original. These weren't technically dishonorable discharges, but they definitely weren't honorable discharges either. The VA quickly decided that a Section 8 meant that a service member was excluded from their entitlements, including health care and the GI Bill. By the end of the war, the number of Section 8 discharges issued to homosexuals was more than 5,000 from the Army and 4,000 from the Navy. But these weren't the only people given Section 8 discharges. The Army in particular handed them out with stunning regularity and increased with frequency as the war drew to a close, primarily giving them to African Americans who complained about segregation policies. In all, the Army issued between 49,000 and 60,000. 22% of African American servicemen were given blue discharges, even though less than 7% of the Army was African American. Despite this hostility, many LGBTQ service members found community and even thrived in the military. Phyllis Arby met her lover Mildred in the WAAC. Servicemen experimenting with their sexuality could often participate in what were essentially makeshift drag shows during performance nights overseas. With a lack of entertainment and even larger lack of women, men often dressed in women's roles in dance numbers, theater skits, and other routines. This allowed men to relax in the heavy machismo attitudes they seem to always carry around the bases and in combat, and take on non-traditional roles for the sake of drama or comedy, which was a welcome reprieve for many who felt more comfortable in those spaces. Our service members receiving Section 8 discharges weren't the only people having their civil liberties curtailed, though. Just like in World War I, the United States federal government uses their wartime powers to crack down on the freedoms of American citizens during World War. Although unlike the First World War, this time it has less to do with the violations of the First Amendment and more to do with due process under the 14th Amendment and the very definition of citizenship itself. In the American territories like Hawaii, for example, which wasn't a state yet, the federal government declared martial law from December 1941 to October 1944. Military police roamed the streets armed and sometimes in tanks. Even in this children's book from the time period, it shows the fear struck into citizens of the territory for infractions as small as traffic violations. In the American territory of the Philippines, historian Daniel Imawar explains how American citizens hunted down Japanese individuals who lived on the island, ransacked their homes, raped the women, and arbitrarily shot prisoners. The Manila police, with American approval since it's our territory, parked trucks full of Japanese internees in the streets for the Japanese to bomb their own people, a form of psychological torture for those inside. Within the continental United States, the federal government placed Japanese American citizens and their immigrant parents who weren't eligible for citizenship due to racist immigration policies into concentration camps. Pressure from nativist groups like the Native Sons of the Golden West in California and Washington, as well as increased pressure from state governors, led President Roosevelt to pass Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, which created zones from which, quote, any or all persons could be excluded if they were deemed a threat. Over the course of the next 6 months, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcefully removed from their homes, stripped of their property, and incarcerated in concentration camps set up by the War Relocation Authority in deserts and other undesirable locations within the United States interior. All of this despite the fact that every intelligence agency asked for a report on the community of the Japanese heritage reported literally no reason for suspicion. In the words of the Senate report that investigated the event in 1980, quote, the promulgation of Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions which followed from it, detention, and ending exclusion, were not driven by analysis of military conditions. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, end quote. Upon arrival at the concentration camps, the facilities weren't finished. Most of the barracks, built to the same specifications as military barracks, had boards missing. All were meant to hold multiple families, but were one-room buildings with no partitions for privacy or separating family units. Bathrooms sometimes had toilets missing. Women's bathrooms that had toilets were often just one giant room with no privacy partitions. Educational, hospital, and eating facilities were understaffed, if staffed at all, and in desperate need of resources. Children were expected to attend school, nevertheless, and stand before a flag each morning to pledge allegiance to the symbol of a democracy that locked them up without regard for their constitutional rights. And like many of the diverse groups before them, they did so with gusto and pride because they were going to prove the United States wrong. If anything, they were going to prove themselves more American than anyone else. Few groups did this as effectively as the Army's 442nd Regiment, which is the most decorated military unit for its size and service in American history. While inside the concentration camps, the federal government sent out a document called the Loyalty Questionnaire, of which the last two questions asked each man if he would pledge loyalty to the United States and if he was willing to serve in the Army. Women received a slightly different form. Now, the questions themselves were actually terrible and horribly worded for reasons that you're welcome to ask me about in class or office hours. And there was a number of men who courageously answered no, no. Some of these men were taken away by the federal government for questioning, and their families never saw them again. But for the men who answered yes, yes, they were eligible for military service. And when they went off to fight, they did so with the understanding that almost literally everyone in the country saw them as having the face of the enemy. And so did the federal government. They were sent on a series of what can only be described as suicide missions. The mission to save the Lost Texas Battalion is one of these, which is where this image comes from. But in the end, it didn't matter very much to the federal government, entrenched in racism against an enemy they refused to understand, that these men were Americans, or even that their valor was unmatched. In 1944, in the case Korematsu versus U.S., the Supreme Court upheld internment as constitutional as a wartime measure. It wasn't until the 1980s that the federal government officially apologized to the Japanese American community for their outrageous behavior during World War II and gave reparations. From the perspective of the United States, the war ends in much the same fashion as it began, by mobilizing our home front materials, in this case, science. The entire time, the Office of Research and Development was working on an atomic bomb through what we call the Manhattan Project at various sites throughout the United States. One might wonder why it wouldn't be smarter to all work together at the same place, but the answer to that is one, you don't want spies infiltrating one singular place and stealing all the information. And two, if somehow the United States was attacked, you don't want all of the data lost if one of those locations gets bombed. So it's smarter to keep it all decentralized in like 10 places. So here we have our team of lead, look, they're all white scientists for the Manhattan Project. And so when we finally figure it out, we develop two bombs of different payloads or sizes, essentially, that President Truman has to decide if he wants to use on Japan. So keep in mind here that Roosevelt has died, sad, and Truman really didn't have much of an idea at all about the Manhattan Project, because remember, the vice president doesn't really do anything, at least not back then. And so when he becomes president, they fill him in and tell him he's got this massively powerful weapon at his disposal to use, and he has to decide to use it or not. Which is really a bit of an ethical dilemma for him, because he can either kill a whole bunch of Japanese citizens in order for us to invade Japan or the Japanese mainland, or we can lose a bunch of American soldiers in the process of doing it. Although military projections had us taking the mainland either way, really. But in the end, he doesn't really actually have much of a choice, because you have to remember that when you're the president, you don't have the luxury of being a person, really. You're the office of the president. And as the office of the president, it is your literal sworn duty to protect the lives of American citizens. And as commander-in-chief of the armed services, it's definitely your job to protect your troops. So it's really a no-brainer for him that his job is to use this weapon to protect his men, which is unfortunate for the civilians of Japan, but that's the position that their government has put them in, not the position that he has put them in. So that's what we do. Mobilizing for World War II on the home front looks similar to World War I in a lot of ways, because our success in both wars was contingent on many of the same things. And in both conflicts, the diversity in thought and experience inherent in our nation's population is what ultimately made us successful, not anything the government could have or did do. And as we move forward, we'll continue to see how that diversity comes in conflict with shifting ideals and creates new forms of thinking about what the goals of the United States should be at home and on the world stage.